At this time on Monday mornings, we take a few minutes and we get a chance to speak with Randy Staples from Idaho Weekly Briefing, and we talk about some of the events that are going on, often political, but sometimes just other news events that are taking place here in Idaho and throughout the Northwest. This morning, of course, Randy's going to be talking to some extent about the column some of you may have seen. I usually read it in one of our regional newspapers on Sunday, and then, of course, I also receive it in the weekly briefing in my email. It's 8:44. Bill Colley with you as well. On top story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, 37. Randy, first of all, welcome back to the show.
Good to be here.
We talked last week about the hopes that Democrats had, I think, in specifically a couple of different locations. Number one, the district, my home district, the 24th, and then in northern Idaho, as Heather Scott was seeing somewhat considered to be a serious challenger, and yet you reflected in the column that things didn't quite turn out the way the Democrats thought they would, and maybe it's still not quite time for them to have their moment in the sun.
Yeah, I wasn't hearing really any real extravagant claims even about these very specific races. Uh, I don't think there were after more than 20 years of being beaten almost everywhere in Idaho. I think Democrats have gotten a little bit cautious about claiming that we are going to take something. Only that this is a little bit of a different situation, and that the possibilities may be a little bit livelier in this place as opposed to that place. Uh, and there was something to that, but yeah, it's this was the case up in northern Idaho, up in the Panhandle. Remember that to put this in context, what we're talking about in grand total here, in terms of competitive or of seats that were even viewed at as possibly competitive, were no more than about a half dozen out of 105 in Idaho. So we're not talking about very many to begin with, just a very few races. And the one in Idaho, Heather Scott, the one in far northern Idaho, the Panhandle, Heather Scott, she was very controversial. Her followers were accused of intimidating and harassing Democrats and really anyone else who was in opposition to her. But she wound up with 3/4 of the vote. The longtime Lewiston historically has been one of the few remaining not even Democratic centers, but places where Democrats had a shot at winning in northern Idaho. But that may be done now. The House Minority Leader John Rushi lost his seat. That's quite a major change because he was a pretty popular figure there, but he got wiped out by a pretty fair margin this time. You now have to in all of Idaho, from Boise to the Canadian border, in all of that vast amount of space, and a considerable number of legislative districts, and from Boise to the Oregon border, for that matter, in all the districts out in Canyon County and so on. All of that, there is exactly one Democratic legislator left. I remember the times a few decades ago when in Idaho you would have on election night races that were pretty closer, in which the Republican was a little bit ahead for a while, and then because northern Idaho is in the Pacific time zone, you'd have Democrats saying, "Well, just wait until the North comes in. We may pull this out yet," and as often as not they did, because the North would vote Democratic. But that seems like an age ago.
Well, you've been doing this long enough that you knew Frank Church and Cecil Andrus, and obviously as Democrats go, I was just reading this morning how Jim Webb got no traction when he was in the primaries, and yet 10 years ago, 30 years ago, Jim Webb represented what the party was really, really all about. Maybe in many cases the party has left a lot of these voters.
Well, it's I haven't. We'll see more about that over time. I'm not so sure that in this case that was as much true. The legislators that you've tended to see and legislative candidates have been, I think, fairly well reflective of their constituencies. A lot of them were a great deal like Russia in Lewiston, who had been personally popular for quite a long time. There didn't seem to be a lot of any real kind of personal animus, but one of the things that happened with Russia in Lewiston was simply he was tied to Hillary Clinton. And there were when I went through Lewiston a few weeks ago, I saw billboards, a number of billboards around town for this state house race. You usually don't see many billboards for those. Uh, that sought to tie Clinton and Russia, and they really didn't have that much in common. But there you are. They were both on the same side of the ballot, and it was pretty easy to just run down the Republican side.
I think that at least what I've been able to glean, and obviously I hear radio callers. That's not necessarily representative of huge swaths of the state, but the land use issues really over the last few decades, it appears, have changed a lot of people's direction. And there's a feeling that the bureaucratic Washington is Democrat Washington, and therefore they're the ones who are behind this. And there seems to be a revolt going on against the Democrats here in the state because of that. Would you say there's some truth to that?
I say there's some truth to it over time. My guess is that probably becomes a little bit less true in more recent times as Idaho has become more suburban. Idaho is usually thought of as a rural state, but like a lot of the rest of the country, its population is becoming more and more suburban. If you look at the legislative districts that have been divided up and have popped up outright, you can look at the Meridian Eagle area in west of Boise and see that's where the population is growing to a great degree. You can look around Twin Falls for that matter and see where the population has been growing, and it's what would be the equivalent of if it were just outside of city limits. It's pretty much the equivalent of the suburbs. That's true over in Idaho Falls. It's true in all the growing areas around Idaho, up in Kootenai County as well.
851. I just wanted to give a quick time check here, Randy. 851 and 39 on KLIX. Sorry to interrupt, but go ahead.
Oh no, that was pretty much it. That a lot of Idaho is more suburban and for that reason a little bit less oriented towards some of the land issues I think than Idaho traditionally was.
Randy Staples is our guest, and of course he's the a publisher of Idaho Weekly Briefing. He joins us on Monday mornings on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. For people who would like to look at the briefing, where would you send them?
I would send them to www.ridenbaugh.com. That's RIDENBAUGH.
We were talking off air, and you referenced Eagle, and I got thinking, who are the most famous people who live in Eagle? Well, Jerry Kramer, whether he likes it or not. Of course, we have a former U.S. Senator who's there, who's Larry Craig, rather well known, and sometimes infamously. But then the other name that comes up is Raul Labrador, who, now that he has finished his run for re-election to the House, there is a lot of speculation that soon he'll be the third Republican who shows an interest in running for governor. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's very possible, and of course you mentioned the Eagle is certainly apropos enough because he's a former state legislator from Eagle. Yeah, I think there's a very real possibility for that. There's a good deal of chatter at this point, and some good reason to believe that he may very well get into it. I had wondered initially whether the fact that Russ Fulcher was already in might be an indicator that Labrador might get in. But I'm pretty well convinced now that that's not going to be the case. Or at least that's not something that's going to that would keep Labrador out. I think that's been there's been plenty of chatter about that. Some of it coming, I think, from the Labrador camp. It's been pretty clear that he is in fact very interested in it. There's even been some talk that he will announce the day after he's sworn into his new term in the U.S. House. But that may be such an early announcement, may almost be a little provocative. But I wouldn't expect a whole lot of time to pass before hearing something on this. These races are getting earlier and earlier. Brad Little has been in it for many months. Russ Fulcher has been in it for several months. They've been organizing, fundraising, and so on. And if you want to get into it in a serious way, you don't want to let a lot of the best people and a good deal of the money go spoken for by the other candidates.
We've got a couple of minutes to go. It's probably a long shot, but hypothetical. Let's say Butch Otter is named Interior Secretary. Little then becomes governor. Does that give him an advantage in any three-way primary?
I think it gives him some advantage. There's Idaho voters in the last few decades have gotten, it seems, increasingly loath to vote against incumbents, but it does happen. It has happened in recent years. Jim Risch, now the U.S. Senator, became senator after serving as lieutenant governor, and he became lieutenant governor by ousting a fellow Republican from that job. And there are other examples too. That can happen. I think it would strengthen Little's hand. I don't think that it would make him invulnerable.
I asked about the governor on Facebook the other day, just my followers, if they would what they would think about him in that role, and it was really a mixed bag. And I think the notion is it's going to be Jan Brewer or someone else who's more high profile. But Governor Otter certainly was on board with the Trump campaign when push came to shove. I would think that he would definitely be on that short list.
I could imagine him as a possibility. That would be a credible possibility. A governor who was loyal without question. There are only but so many like that around the country, and I could imagine Otter as being on the short list there. The resource areas has been an area that he's had some interest in. He's a third-term governor, so he's been to a great degree. He's been vetted. There are some spots on his resume over the years, but they've all been pretty well vetted, and people know what they are. I doubt that there's a whole lot more that you would find out about Butch Otter that we don't already know.
And I would think the only drawback is, at least in his case, he may not want to move back to Washington.
He seemed to be fairly eager to return to Idaho from Washington. He could have stayed easily in the U.S. House. He served there 3 terms, and he certainly could have stayed in that district, continued representing it for some time to come, or run for the Senate. But he didn't choose to do that. He wanted to come back. So, yeah, I think that might be one question. Whether, particularly also at his age in the 70s now, whether he would necessarily want to uproot himself for a period like 4 years or so.
I do want to thank you again for joining us this morning. And before we wrap up, once more, for the website, for people out there who'd like to take a look at the entire briefing, where do you send them?
It is www.reidenbach.com, RIDENBAUGH.
I want to thank you again, Randy, and we'll chat again next Monday morning.
Very good. We'll talk to you then.
Randy Staples joining us today from Idaho Weekly Briefing right here on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. I should note, I think the discussions I've had with Governor Otter have not gotten into the depth of him having an interest in going back to Washington. The most contentious discussion I've ever had with a governor, we referenced Jerry Kramer during our discussion, and I said Kramer was Idaho's greatest athlete, and the governor insisted no, it was Killebrew. So it may be that Kramer hasn't supported the governor. Who knows? We haven't had a chance to ask him. 8:58, Bill Colley with you on Top Story. Christy Zitto coming up in just a few minutes. She has been newly elected to the Idaho State Legislature from the area up around Glens Ferry and Mountain Home, but she represents a swath of Twin Falls County as well, and definite political outsider. She'll be taking some of your telephone calls possibly as well in the next half hour. In the meantime, Fox News is on the way, and right now we have 38.